right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. I'm so excited that you're here with us today. My name is Tony Sanchez, and I'm here with Pastor Larry Starkey. And for the first time on Deep Dive, we have Luisel Lawler. So I think we're going to have a good time today. But a person that's not here with us is Pastor Jeff Robinson, our lead pastor here at Grace. And the reason for that is because a third addition to his family came into the picture last week as his third son, Daniel Foster Robinson, was born. So naturally, he's at home helping his wife with their 3 boys. And so we just want to give our pastor some time to rest, even though he loves doing these. I mean, he absolutely loves doing Deep Dive. He's asked us to do the best that we can to lead this today. And I think it's going to be really, really good. So let's continue to pray for Pastor Jeff as he rests this week. And we'll see him back in the pulpit this coming Sunday. So as we've been going through a relationship series, relationship reboot, we want to go ahead and go through some of these large questions, these bigger questions that we want to dive deep into. So as we start out today, we're going to talk about biblical womanhood. And so Luisel Lawler is here to answer some of these questions about that as we close out this relationship reboot series. And also we're going to be going back into the book of Romans. Our series When in Rome 1. And so hopefully we're going to answer some really important questions there. So as we start out this deep dive, I'm going to throw a question over to Luisel. And here is that question, Luisel. In this series we've been doing Relationship Reboot, we're learning about biblical womanhood this coming Sunday. And Sunday is going to be really special because we're going to celebrate mothers for Mother's Day. So the question I have for you is, in what ways does the Christian view of womanhood differ from our culture's view of womanhood?
All right. Well, I'm really glad that we're discussing this today because I think that due to a misconception of what biblical womanhood is and also how the culture defines womanhood, I think most women, if they're honest, would struggle with defining womanhood themselves. We see in our culture, there's a lot of pressure on women nowadays to all these added roles that they've been given, so trying to maintain the pressure of all of that, but yet still feeling very undervalued as women. And so I think it's great that we're going to try to define the two because they are different, even in how they are presented, but also in their truth. So let's start with cultural womanhood. I think the culture's view of womanhood obviously has always been defined by the value or lack of value that it places on women. So it changes based on the culture and the times. But I think generally if we were to look at how the culture defines womanhood, it would be based on what they do and how they look. So in our American culture, I think in an attempt to liberate women, the feminist movement came along and said, you can be everything that a man can be and better. And so it was an attempt for women to just be able to be strong and in charge and in control. And what that has done is it's actually caused women to feel like their feminine attributes that they have have to be suppressed. So the feminine attributes of being compassionate, being sacrificially loving, having intuition, being sensitive, being caring, all of those things are viewed negatively in the culture as a weakness instead of a strength. So the woman, therefore, has to actually take on some of the male attributes to be successful in today's culture and have a career and be a provider financially and have all this success. And then the role of the wife and the mother is almost devalued in our society. And so I talk to women all the time who struggle with these two concepts because they have this pressure from society and all these roles that they have taken that society has given them, and yet they are struggling with what their heart's desire is and feel like they can't follow that. I think the cultural view of womanhood has really ended up restricting women, not liberating them, and also if you look at how they view women as far as looks are concerned, I think the culture has always defined women by their beauty and their body composition. And that is something that changes based on the culture, but it's unattainable for most women because we're all built differently. And so no matter how much we strive financially or physically to obtain it, we can never measure up. So this leaves women feeling completely unvalued, overwhelmed, and unable to meet the expectations that the culture places on them. Now, if we look at biblical womanhood, I think there's a misconception with biblical womanhood that it is suppressive, submissive servanthood. And that is, we are lesser than men and we are here to serve men. But that is a complete misconception of how God created women. If we look all the way back to the beginning, when he created Adam and Eve, he said in Genesis 1:27, let's make man in our image. In his image he created them, both male and female he created them. So he uniquely created men and women with different attributes that God himself possesses that are both unique to men and women, but are both perfectly God. And so those attributes give us the ability to fulfill the God-ordained roles that we have. And so when we see that, we see also in Genesis 2 that God said it was not good for man to be alone. So God created woman to be a helper beside him. And that word helper in the Hebrew is azar. It doesn't mean servant. It actually is used in reference to God more than 16 times in the Bible. It's more of a term of like a helper, protector, provider, as in a nurturing kind of way. And so we see that the woman plays a tremendous role because biblical womanhood defines women's values based on who they are, not what they do. And in God's eyes, womanhood is something very valuable. We have a unique role to fill that only we can fill. And so I think when women in general are able to accept or embrace that role and those attributes, they finally have the peace and the freedom and the purpose in life to fulfill the things that their heart desires instead of the cultural pressures that they feel. And honestly, when women are able to do that, we will see a huge change in our society with the family and in marriages and society in general.
It's really good.
Well, thank you, Luisel.
Yeah, did you have anything to add to that, Larry?
That's exactly what I would have said if I would have answered the question. That was tremendous, Luisel. Thank you.
Well, if you
And thank you, Lord, for bringing Luisel here to answer that question. Oh, that was tremendous.
Well, there's a couple of things there that stood out to me. I think just the whole idea of the qualities that women have, because some of the things that you mentioned, if you think about it, those are some of the qualities of God.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost as if we're telling women to go against those qualities that even God displays, from the sacrificing,
Right.
To the lovingness. I mean, imagine if God, if we just place God in that area where this is how God is. He's like all men. This is how men are, so this is how God is, and we don't really see that in the Gospels, and in the Bible in general. And I think the other thing too is the pressure. I mean, the pressure that women feel. And I know that you talk to a lot of women throughout your week and where they're at spiritually. Even this past Sunday when I preached and I was able to talk to some women after service and just hearing from them the pressure that they felt, whether in their relationships or even in their careers. And that just weighs on them, and they feel like they have to choose either my family or my career. And so I definitely, I see that more than ever. And so that's just a great misconception that we see in our culture on how women should act, and really taken away from that womanhood that God has given them. And I'll tell you what, without my wife being in my life and being a nurturer to me and helping me, I would not see some of the flaws in my own life without. I think I've learned more in marriage than I have thinking I could just do things on my own, which is a lie. So I'll tell you what, I think that's just a fantastic answer, and Larry already knew this. So,
Luisel, a lot of our viewers may not know you because this is your first time with us on Deep Dive. So you're an author, and you're a speaker, and you have discipled hundreds of ladies. And also, you're the director of our women's ministries here at Grace Fellowship.
Yeah.
Wife, mom, grandma. Will you just take 30 seconds or a minute or so? Tell our viewers about yourself a little bit, because I do think your answer was tremendous.
Absolutely.
And I think people are going to want to know a little bit more about who is Luisel.
Okay. So my name is Luisel, and I have been married to my husband now for 38 years, and we have 5 children by birth and 3 more that have been grafted into our family by marriage. My soon to be 4th, because my son got engaged this past weekend. So we also have 9 grandchildren and 1 on the way.
Wow.
I do work here at the church. I love what I do. I'm the women's ministry director for the church. And as Larry said, I've done different things: discipleship, wrote a book that God told me to write. So those of you think it's too big, when God tells you to do something, just do what he tells you. And so I just love being able to speak to women and encourage them. I was a full-time mom most of my motherhood years, but also did something on the side to make a little bit extra money. And so I understand the struggles that women go through nowadays, especially having daughters that are trying to raise their children. It's very difficult in our society, but I think when we embrace the things that God has created us to be, both men and women, that we don't have to compete against each other. We complement each other. And I think it's a team effort, and we can make an impact on society if we do it that way.
Well said. Thanks again for being with us. And again, to all of our viewers, reach out to Luisel Lawler if you need some advice, need some guidance. And thanks, Luisel. So, Mother's Day this Sunday is our last message in our Relationship Reboot series. And then Pastor Jeff is going to get back to his study verse by verse through the book of Romans, and his series is called When in Rome. So he's going to pick up with a section in that first chapter that is just one of the most powerful and a very powerful book overall, the book of Romans, and it's Romans 1:16, where Paul writes, I am not ashamed of the gospel. So, Tony, I'd like to bounce this question over to you. Why can a Christian be confident and not ashamed of the gospel of Christ?
Yeah, so this is a great verse in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, where I would say this is the theme of Romans, right? Paul's saying, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And he says here in that verse, for it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. And so I was thinking about the word shame, all right? I think all of us in our lives at some point, we've experienced shame in one way or another. And you look at certain cultures, especially in Eastern cultures, there's this aspect of honor and shame, where you don't want to shame your family, you want to bring them honor. It's a little bit less common here. But I would even say even in some maybe Hispanic cultures and other different cultures, even in America, we don't want to shame our families. I think it's universal, but more in some than others. But think about like growing up, and maybe you were in a family situation where there was some kind of a family member or something in your own household that you had shame about. Like you didn't want that to be the case, and maybe people knew about it and you were made fun of because of it, or whatever that may look like. You were embarrassed because of this. Or if you were on a team, that the last thing you want to do is let that team down and bring shame to that team, right? Whatever team that may be. I was just searching online, and I went to gotquestions.org, and it talked about the word ashamed in this passage, and it said that it means to be disgraced or humiliated. In a way, it's like someone being singled out for misplacing his confidence in something that he trusted in. And so I think about that, and that's not really what Paul is talking about here. He's not saying that he's misplaced his confidence. If anything, you look at Paul's life, and you see that he was, if anything, ashamed of his prior life, and the things he thought he was doing, that he was supposed to be doing. He has this radical encounter with Jesus, and then he starts doing the work of Christ. He starts going out, and people just start going against him because he's preaching the gospel. Because it's not that Paul was ashamed. No, he actually goes against that. And how do we know that? Because in verse 15 he says that I'm eager to preach. Before you get to 16, verse 16, he says, I'm eager to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome. Why? Because it's the power of God. And then in verse 17, it's the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. And as I was studying for the message that I was able to preach this past Sunday as well, I was going through the book of 2 Timothy, and Paul is writing to him, and he uses that word again in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 8. He says, don't be ashamed, Timothy, of the testimony of our Lord, or of me being his prisoner. He uses that word again. Don't be ashamed, but join with me, Timothy, in suffering for the gospel according to the power of God. There it is again. He says it to those in Rome. He says it to Timothy here. And then in verse 12, for this reason I also suffer for these things. Again, why? Because I'm not ashamed. I'm not ashamed. Paul says, I know what I believe, and I'm convinced that God is able to guard me because he's entrusted me with this until that day when I get to see him again. And so he talks about this, and it's not as if Paul has never gone through shame. And in 2 Corinthians, he talks about the fact that he's been shipwrecked. He's almost been through death so many times. 5 times he's been lashed. Night and day he's been out in the sea. He's been almost robbed. His countrymen went against him. I mean, Paul has endured shame for the cause of Christ. I mean, we see that here. So he says that regardless of these things, and even Jesus, when you look at Jesus' life, Jesus was accused, he was beaten before he even went to the cross, and he endured it. And I love what the writer of Hebrews says in chapter 12, verse 2. He says, for the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross, despising, there it is, the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. So ultimately, the reason why we don't have to be ashamed of the gospel, just like Paul wasn't, is because Christians aren't called to avoid shame, but to trust God in it. You trust God in it because in Paul's day, today, and moving forward until we either see the Lord or he returns, there's always going to be naysayers, there's always going to be critics, and there's always going to be a point in our lives when we're going to have to endure shame for the cause of Christ. But like Paul, we're convicted and called as believers to that calling, especially when we see verses like Acts chapter 4, verse 12, where it says that there is salvation in no one else, for there's no name under heaven that has been given among men by which we must be saved. So we don't have to be ashamed, right? Paul wasn't ashamed because for him, he was eager to preach the gospel. Why? Because more and more people are going to come to know Jesus, and that is what matters most, regardless of what we may feel at times, regardless of what people may tell us. We've been convicted, we've been changed, and we want to offer that change because we have experienced right here with these folks next to me that power in our lives of that change that God has done, and why wouldn't we want to offer that to other people, right? When people are going through things, we want to give them the greatest hope of all that has changed us, and we want them to be changed as well. We want you all to experience that same life change that God offers through Christ. So I'm just excited, and you're right. That one in Rome series, going verse by verse. I mean, we could spend so much time in the book of Romans. I love the book of Romans. It's full of so much meat. So, Larry, I'm going to throw it over to you as we continue in this one in Rome series here in a few weeks, and we're learning through it. And here's my question to you. As we're learning from Romans 1, God has given us an abundance of evidence for his existence through his creation, and we see that throughout the Bible. But what are some of these evidences that we do see here in Romans, and why do people ignore or even try to suppress those evidences for God?
Yeah, well, that is from Romans chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. Let me read that for us real quick.
Yeah.
For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. Then Paul says, so they are without excuse. Now there's an Old Testament counterpart to this written by David, Psalm 19, verses 1 through 4. Let me read that as well real quickly. And as I read it, notice the verbs as I read this. The heavens declare the glory of God. The sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words where their voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. So with regard to nature being evidence for God's existence, Paul in the New Testament and David in the Old Testament are saying, the more you look, the more you see. The more you look, the more evidence for God you're going to see. Now, this is called the design argument or the teleological argument. And basically, it simply claims that the existence of God is the best explanation for the order and the design that we see in our universe. Now, science helps us understand that there are numerous laws of physics, things like the cosmic laws of gravity, electron mass, thermodynamics, nuclear forces, electromagnetic forces, speed of light, and so forth. And all of these laws of physics work in finely tuned, perfect harmony to support complex life, like human life, to live on planet Earth. For example, a couple of quick, easy to understand examples. The distance of the Earth to the sun. It's 93 million miles. Now, if the Earth was any closer to the sun, we would burn up. If the Earth was any farther from the sun, we would freeze. So the Earth is just the right amount of distance away from the sun to sustain human life on planet Earth. That's an example of the fine-tuning of the universe. Here's another example, and that's the size of the moon. If the moon was any larger than it currently is, the gravitational pull on the oceans would be too strong, and we would all be underwater right now. But if the moon was any smaller than it is, the gravitational pull on the oceans would be so weak that the oceans would be like a puddle of stagnant water on your driveway after a heavy rain. It couldn't sustain life. And so if the oceans couldn't sustain life, that would tremendously impact, catastrophically impact life on planet Earth. In fact, we couldn't live on Earth. So just things like the distance of the Earth to the sun and the size of the moon, those are just a couple of many numerous examples, again, of the fine-tuning of the universe. So here's kind of the point that I think Paul is making in Romans 1 and that David is leading up to there in that Psalm 19. The universe's precise fine-tuning cannot be the result of accidental, unguided, random, chaotic events. In other words, the best explanation for a design like we see in our universe, or fine-tuning like we see in our universe, is there's got to be a designer behind it. There's got to be a fine-tuner behind it. It would be like going to a symphony where you hear this wonderful orchestra playing and walking out and thinking that all of that was just the result of chance, that those guys and ladies had never practiced, there was no conductor, they just started playing their instruments and beating on the drums, and just by sheer accident that this beautiful music came about. Of course not. The best explanation for the harmony in that symphony is that there's a conductor behind it, and it was all planned and organized and designed. And in the same way, when you look at the incredible fine-tuning and design of our universe, again, the best explanation is that there's a fine-tuner, a designer, a conductor behind it. And we call that fine-tuner, we call that designer, we call that conductor God. Imagine just for a moment that you're taking a walk through the woods, and you've never been through these woods before, and you come across a cabin. You walk into that cabin, and as soon as you walk in the front door, there in the living room of the cabin, there's a big screen TV, and it's playing your favorite movie. And as you walk through the cabin, you can hear that your favorite music is playing. You walk into the kitchen, and there your favorite foods and snacks have been laid out on the kitchen table. Now, what would be the best explanation for that? You've never been in those woods before. You've never been in that cabin before. Which would make better sense? That just by random, accidental chance, that cabin appeared and it just happened to have your favorite things in it? Or would this be a better explanation? Someone who knows you well, someone who knows your favorite movie, knows your favorite music, knows your favorite food, knows your favorite snacks, knew that at some point in the future you would be walking through those woods, and they built that cabin there intentionally, purposely for you. Which one of those two explanations would be the best? Well, of course, the best explanation would be that someone who knew you well knew you'd be walking through those woods and built that cabin just for you. That's what Paul is saying. That's what David is saying. That's what the Bible is saying, is that God finely tuned, God designed this universe and then created us, knowing that we would walk through this planet Earth and get to explore the outer reaches of outer space. He designed this universe with us in mind. And so that's what Paul is saying. That's what David is saying here, that God has given an abundance of evidence for his existence through his creation. And he's saying that those who close their eyes to the evidences, they're without excuse. But for those who open their eyes, the more you look, the more you see. The more you look, the more you'll see evidence of God's existence. I can't wait till Pastor Jeff really digs into that passage and really talks to us more about the evidences of God's existence through his creation. So, well, thanks for letting me answer that question, Tony. I'm going to pass it back over to you.
Yeah, that's really good. I want to find that cabin because I'd like to be in it. That's really fun. I also like your examples there. You know, you talked about if we were any closer to the sun. I think God purposely put South Florida closer to the sun because I'm always feel like I'm burning here without a pool. And so I think that's just really good, just with the evidences. So. Hey, that's all we have for today for Deep Dive. I love doing Deep Dive, especially with our guest today, with Luisel and Larry. Thank you so much, guys, for your answers and your preparation and just sharing your hearts with us. Don't forget this Sunday, Mother's Day, at all three of our services, whether you're coming here live or watching online, make sure you bring your mother or your mother figure to that. It's going to be great, a really special service for you moms out there. Also, don't forget on Sunday mornings we have Starting Point where at 10 a.m. Every single Sunday, and this Sunday I'll be able to walk through what we believe. You get to meet some of our leaders and directors and basically everything that we do here at Grace we get to talk to you about. So I'd love to have you there if you've been wanting to come to that. And make sure you watch some of our other deep dives as well, as we're doing some great things. I know Pastor Larry and Pastor Jeff do a grace track theology where they go through some of the big questions that we have on Christianity. Please, please, please continue to pray for our pastor and his family and for them to continually get rest this week. And we'll see you next time here at Deep Dive. God bless you all.